Hey everyone, this video is all about GPUs or graphics processing units and whether or not you need one. And to start off, basically yes, every computer has one, or at least every computer that you're going to use, anybody watching this channel is going to use. And I'm going to go over just a couple of some of the basics anyways. So this is a typical CPU, and normally you would see this heat spreader, this metal heat spreader on top of it, if it's going into a desktop. This is a typical laptop CPU. Now in either case, there's normally an integrated GPU. So CPU is central processing unit, GPU is graphics processing unit. And so normally under here, there would be a GPU, or like in the case of this laptop CPU, the GPU is built in. And I'm not going to take it out of this bag because these are kind of grimy actually, and when I get to that one you'll kind of see why. But this right here is the actual piece of silicon where the circuitry, where the transistors lie, the CPU and the GPU and some other things, some input-output circuitry and so on. Now on a desktop CPU, that's normally underneath a heat spreader. On a laptop, they don't normally have an integrated heat spreader like that because they try to make laptops thin and because they're not changed as often. And so part of the reason for this is heat, where desktop CPUs create more heat and that heat needs to be dissipated. But part of it is for mechanical safety, so that when someone is installing or removing a CPU, there's less of a chance of them damaging this little piece of silicon, which is pretty brittle. Not quite so bad as glass, but kind of similar. So anyways, this is a CPU and it would have an integrated GPU in it normally. So let's get this out of the way. This again is a laptop one, and in the same circuitry is a CPU and GPU. This is another laptop model, and in here there's a GPU and a separate CPU. They're on the same chip. In other words, they're on the same processor substrate, I guess, but they're two separate pieces of silicon. And in laptops like this one I think is a second gen, is a Sandy Bridge Intel Core i5. When you go up to a Core i7 in Sandy Bridge anyways, they did not have a GPU. Not built in with the CPU. You had to rely upon what's called discrete graphics. So there's iGPUs and discrete graphics. I for integrated, you might see discrete graphics called DGPU, little dGPU. And then what we've got here is a totally separate GPU that would go into a desktop. So this is a PCI Express X16 slot. NVIDIA is the brand. This is the actual GPU itself. And in this one, you don't set it into a socket, but rather it's soldered onto that board, onto this board. So anyways, that's sort of the hardware. Let's talk about the differences. So iGPUs, since they're in such a small package, they can't dissipate heat as well, and they have to use shared system memory. So they use system RAM, which tends to be slow for graphics processing anyways, and is limited. So if you've got 8 gigabytes of system memory, which is pretty typical for Windows 10, then part of that, maybe a gig, maybe half a gig, needs to be allocated to the integrated GPU. What's different on a discrete GPU is that the system memory is right here. And so it doesn't need to be shared. There's usually still some shared, but it doesn't need to be. It's got its own separate video RAM, VRAM packages. But it uses more power, it takes up space, and in a laptop that makes a big difference. The laptop that I have, the Dell over there, has both an integrated GPU and a discrete GPU, and you can actually select which one you want to use. So at this point you're probably asking yourself, great, why do I care? Well, the first thing that usually comes to people's minds is gaming, and yes, having a good GPU matters for gaming, but not only gaming. And actually this one right here is junk in terms of gaming. This one right here has a weird connector that you've probably never seen before. I don't even know the name of it offhand, to be honest with you. But it has an adapter that comes with it. This is the adapter. This plugs into the card, and what you end up with is 2 DVI outputs, and then the blue ones here are just DVI to VGA adapters. You could also adapt from DVI to HDMI or DisplayPort, or just plug it into a DVI monitor. And this specifically is made just to have more monitors connect to your computer. So if your desktop only has a CPU with integrated graphics and only has 1, maybe 2 outputs, adding a discrete card like this allows you to have 2, 3, 4 monitors. And that's good for productivity for certain types of workflows. So that's one possible case. Gaming, of course, is one scenario, and I'm not even getting into that. With gaming cards, you're usually looking at much larger cards that use a lot more wattage. This one here probably uses around 15 to 25 watts, something like that. The PCI Express connector, actually, this part of it here is for power, and that can only supply 75 watts. So this card is definitely under 75 watts, and my guess is it's under 30 as well. I'm pretty confident in that, without looking it up. Gaming discrete graphics cards are upwards of, they can be as high as 4 or even 500 watts. Some of them will have 2 of these GPUs on one single card and can be upwards beyond 500 watts. So they use more power, they create more heat, but they also give you way more performance. And that performance isn't just for gaming, isn't just for multi-monitor, but for teachers especially. It can be used for video editing, and there are some other advantages too. Newer NVIDIA cards, in fact, can be used. There's an NVIDIA, and I don't know the term that they're using for it, but there's an NVIDIA sound software that makes it so that when you're using Zoom or Google Meets or Microsoft Teams, it will automatically noise cancel the ambient noise around you so that you get a more crisp, clear sound, even though it's a graphics chip. There are differences between CPUs and GPUs. So architecturally, they're very different, and they're set up to do a different set of calculations. So CPUs can do some rudimentary graphics, but CPUs are made to do a lot of more complex types of algorithms, mathematical calculations. GPUs typically do simpler calculations, but they have to do them thousands and thousands of times repeated over and over and over. And so you can't really replace one with the other. You can use CPUs to get some graphics out of them, but it's really bad. And when using things like virtual machines, usually you're using virtual graphics running on a CPU, and it's never high quality. It's always slow and usually jittery and such. And there's a reason for that. They're really two different beasts. So if you're gaming, if you have multi-monitors, or as a teacher, if you're doing things like video editing, this can really speed up video editing. If you've got a video and you let's say you're going to edit a video, so you bring the video into the software, rather than having it load to the slow system memory and compute and do its modifications off of the CPU, since those tend to be simple calculations, you can run it off of a GPU with graphics memory and have it run much quicker. And even to the point where your changes can be seen in real time, which is much easier in terms of graphics editing. The other thing that it can do is transcoding. So if you have a Plex media server, having certain GPUs in there, specifically NVIDIA GPUs, not this one, because this one is just made for multi-monitor and it's really not good for anything else, but GPUs that have what's called the NVENC encoder are nice because they can transcode video streams. So even though the GPU will be in your local computer, when you're streaming that video to someone else, or when someone else is more or less bringing it into their own home, into their own computer, whether it's on your local network or somewhere else, it will automatically change the quality depending on the bandwidth and depending on the system, and it can change the resolution. It can also change the codec that's being used. So for instance, if you're watching a video through Plex on your phone, and your phone doesn't have whatever codec that video was in, the GPU can transcode it on the fly. And I say on the fly, it will buffer out a bit, and then it will continue to be buffered. That's basically what Netflix does as well, and YouTube, and that's why sometimes you'll be watching a YouTube video and you'll see the quality will drop. Well, it doesn't do that automatically. It does it based on the internet connection. But if you just had a poor internet connection and it was sending the same video file at a constant bit rate and a constant resolution, you would end up having it stop, buffer for a ways, play for a minute or two, stop, buffer, play. It'd be annoying. Instead, what you get are those big pixely blocks, and that's because GPUs typically, again, CPUs can do it, but they're not very efficient or effective. GPUs are transcoding that video so that you can watch it without stutters and jitters and everything, and with the highest possible quality as well. So GPUs are not just for gaming, and for teachers, a lot of us are looking for laptops because we want to be able to bring them to school and back. And again, you can get laptops that have integrated GPUs or integrated GPUs and discrete GPUs. They're in a different package. They don't look like this. They're built into the motherboard usually, but they're separate from the CPU. And that can give you that better video processing power and audio processing power for certain NVIDIA ones to really improve your workflow, considering we're all making a bunch of movies now and so on. The other thing is you can get some benefits with Zoom and Meets and so on, or at least fewer jitters and stutters. It can make your camera look a bit better. It just improves graphic quality across basically any program that uses that's graphics intensive. So whether or not you need a GPU depends on what work you're doing. So if we're talking about teachers, forget gaming, forget multi-monitor for that matter, because that's kind of a niche thing. It's usually used by folks who want to have multiple monitors for whatever reason. And let's forget that for a moment. But if you're the person in your group who's doing a whole bunch of video editing, it might be worth it to have a separate GPU in your laptop or in your desktop than just the integrated one. You can literally take a movie that might take, say it's a 20-minute long video, and it might take 14 minutes to encode it, to do the edits that you've made and so on with just a CPU or with the integrated GPU alone, and it might drop that down to say 4 or 6 minutes with a good discrete dedicated GPU. And so there are some huge advantages. But the question of whether you need it, most teachers probably don't need it. But again, if you're that tech teacher, you might be interested in it. So anyways, that was just sort of a quick primer. If you ever hear GPU, or maybe you hear your students talk about it, they'll say something like, oh yeah, I just, talking with one another about gaming, they may say, oh, I just bought an NVIDIA 3060 or something like that. That's what they're talking about. There's desktop, laptop ones, which can look basically any way because there's not a good set standard for laptops, but most of them are built into the motherboards. There's integrated, and then there's also integrated. So anyways, I just thought I'd do a quick hardware video since April sucks, and I'm bored because we're completely locked down here in Istanbul. So hopefully this helps somebody out. Enjoy.